ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be in such a beautiful place. And thanks very much, John, for kindly inviting me. And also, on behalf of all of us, I'm sure we'd like to express our appreciation to you for arranging these things. This is a pretty unique type of forum it is completely unique in Australian local government, and thanks for taking the time and effort every year to kindly arrange this. Now this morning I'm going to talk about amalgamation, always a contentious question in Australia. It is by far the most important instrument used by Australian state governments when they regulate, if that's the correct word, local government. If one looks at Australian history over the recent past, in fact, local government amalgamation goes back way before federation. There are instances, for example, in New South Wales local government of amalgamations, both forced and voluntary, in the 19th century. But looking more recently, the last couple of decades, every single state local government jurisdictions had amalgamation in Australia, with the sole exception of Western Australia. And those of you from Western Australia will know that that is a pressing question there now. The Robson Review has called for sweeping amalgamations of Perth local government, as we heard so eloquently yesterday. In New South Wales, there are pretty drastic mergers are proposed, largely for metropolitan New South Wales, but also county council type models, which is sort of perhaps could be argued as a form of de facto amalgamation in non-metropolitan New South Wales. At the same time, disaffection with amalgamation, as it's always existed, continues. We've seen in Queensland there's widespread unhappiness about the 2008 amalgamation program. De-amalgamation processes are now occurring in some councils. It's not at all clear why the Queensland government gave them the go-ahead and not other communities that also wanted to de-amalgamate, and no doubt we'll see in future further de-amalgamation efforts there. In the Northern Territory, they had the most drastic ever amalgamation process in Australian local government history. There's tremendous unhappiness. I myself are going to go up to Alice Springs and have a few drinks in the casino there in a few weeks' time. There's widespread unhappiness about how these new so-called super shires have worked out, and people are really fed up. How big is this? If as advocates of amalgamation claim that there's always this pressing need to create larger and larger local authorities, we would expect, wouldn't we, that Australia in international terms has got comparatively small local councils, hence the pressing need to make them bigger. Nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at amongst advanced countries, OECD countries, they're the fourth largest on average. This average figure, of course, they're very small ones in Australia and very large ones. The United Kingdom has got the largest councils by far, by a country mile. Denmark, and then New Zealand, not that far away from Australia. Most European countries, especially the southern, central European, very small local councils. France, 1,500 people, Switzerland, 2,500, Italy's pretty small too, Austria also. What's the theoretical proposition? Most advocates of amalgamation don't even ponder the question, is there a theoretical structure or kind of a meta-structure underlying arguments for amalgamation? And indeed there is. It originates in economics, an area of economics called IO economics for short, industrial organization economics. It was developed in the Great Depression, a fairly similar period in US history to the present, where people looked at a great deal of concentration in industry and said highly concentrated industry leads to a certain type of behavior. The argument here is that you have an industry structure that generates a certain type of conduct, and that leads to some sort of outcome or performance. If we place that in the local government context, council size, under this structure leads to a type of council conduct, and that leads to a type of council performance. Advocates say larger councils will provide better management and greater scale, so they'll conduct themselves differently, and this will lead to different sorts of outcomes, notably lower costs and improved outcomes. As we'll see, the lower cost argument is being downplayed nowadays by advocates of amalgamation, largely because they're forced to concede it hasn't ever happened. So the argument's now shifting onto vaguer type of things like enhanced capacity, things that nobody can measure. So what is the argument? You're all pretty familiar with this, so I'll run through this relatively quickly. Some of the claims differ a little bit. Some people say bigger is better in the sense you get superior planning, regional integration, regional development type outcomes. Others, not so much recently because the evidence is so overwhelmingly against it, that bigger is cheaper, that somehow if you have larger councils they'll provide cheaper services. And sometimes it's improved quality is the argument, or bigger means better services. Often these arguments are all conflated into one argument. You find this in several of these reports. Those of you, for example, who've read the Robson report will find all three of these claims echoed in that report. The same thing in the STCA report. My colleague Graham, the next speaker this morning, he might narrow some of those claims down, but at present all three of those arguments also exist in the independent panel's interim report for New South Wales. It's interesting, I'm emphasising this again because it is quite an interesting but unremarked change in the nature, the claims made in these reports. There's a shift in emphasis away from the previous heavy emphasis on cost savings as a consequence of amalgamation, more nowadays to enhanced capacity arguments. Very hard to challenge enhanced capacity arguments because you can't measure them, you can't systematically make claims on them. So it is good ground to fight on, isn't it, if you're empirically shaky. But what does the empirical evidence, such as it is, what does it tell us? Let's do a brief detour through this empirical stuff. In Australia, the major source of evidence on the outcomes of amalgamation are the various official inquiries that have occurred over the last decade, since around about, in fact, since 2001, the Commonwealth Grants Commission. There have been a series of federal government and various state government reports, but also state local government association reports. That might make a difference. Who pays the piper calls the tune, as we know. Almost all of these reports, almost all, the exceptions being the Queensland, I think it was called the Queensland Local Government Reform Commission, which produced one of the hastiest produced reports surely in living history. They received over 1 million pages of submissions, miraculously read them in 3 weeks and wrote a report in 2 weeks. It was a good effort. With exceptions like that, all of these things find the same thing, that advocates of amalgamation made various claims. We know in the South Australian case, which wasn't that hard-handed or heavy-handed an instance, claims were made about cost savings. Here in Victoria, the Kennett government had a drastic amalgamation program. Various claims were made about how costs would fall by 20%. Now, Europe, an economist who looks at public sector outcomes, you never ever see cost changes of 20%, so you know someone's having somebody on. Kennett himself didn't even believe that because he then put those of you who my age will recall, he put a freeze on rates then, so he didn't even walk his own talk, which is quite an interesting thing. Something that almost all advocates of amalgamation forget about, one way or another, are the actual costs of amalgamation, the so-called transformation costs, taking 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 smaller councils and combining them into a larger local government entity. Those costs are very significant. We get some idea, recent idea of the magnitude of those costs from Queensland, where the Queensland government, after the fact, said, okay, councils, those councils have been amalgamated, kindly let us know how much it cost. Various councils did, some of you are probably involved in that process. Councils calculated how it cost. Perhaps there was, I'm sure there was an element of ambit claiming in it. In any case, it came to a lot of money, about 100, from memory, I think about $196 million. Lots of things can happen with money of that magnitude. A lot, as you all very well know, lots of things can happen. The QTC, the Queensland Treasury Corporation, took a look at this and then said, no, you can't count all these different items. They narrowed what counted as a cost of amalgamation. Even redundancy payments, for example, didn't count as a cost of amalgamation. Quite a distinct ambit claim on the downside, so you've got an immense difference, but even they came up with something like $30 million, even neglecting, ignoring, overlooking, whatever word you think best describes it, even they found it was substantial. That was, of course, a snapshot, a picture at a moment in time, but costs roll on. I'm in quite frequent contact with some of these councils in Queensland, some of the regional councils, Toowoomba Regional Council, for example. There are guys on the telephone to me at least once a week reporting new, what they often describe as atrocities, new expenditures being uncovered, all kinds of things happen. As an aside, no one's ever done a study of this, but sometimes you get small councils that are reasonably solvent getting combined with larger entities that aren't solvent, so they think to themselves, right, on the 1st of January we amalgamated, we've got 6-7 months, let's spend the surplus before the bastards get their hands on it. That's a type of cost from amalgamation. No one's ever done an estimate of that. That's one of my dreams before I hang up my boots. I'm going to try and get some idea. You might have to have anonymous respondents or something. Amongst the various inquiries, the 2006 PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC report was quite, I thought, a pretty useful piece of work. It had a significant finding. The authors themselves didn't really emphasize this much, but they found that at that point, remember at that time, prior to 2006, only South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria and New South Wales had amalgamations, and Queensland, the Northern Territory and WA had not then had experienced amalgamations. You'd think, wouldn't you, that if amalgamations did make a significant difference to the operational performance of local government, you'd expect you to have some systematic statistical difference, and there was no difference in sustainability. No difference. That's an interesting finding. Let's look at the academic literature. There is an immense academic literature. An immense, is mostly in the United States, because most scholars of local government live in the United States. They haven't, by the way, had that many amalgamations there. Most of them are voluntary mergers or consolidations that are referred to in the US. But in Australia, there's a substantial literature, and as we'll see, it's also evolving quite nicely. The problem is it's largely case study based, so it's a bit in the eye of the beholder. You don't have comparators. It's good to have a council that wasn't amalgamated, compare it with one that was in terms of cost things. It's better still if you've got a broad sample and you can make some statistically significant inferences. That thus far, until recently, hasn't occurred in Australia. But in this existing extant literature, amalgamation, almost all of the papers find amalgamation doesn't meet expectations. Sometimes there's improvements, but they never meet, or almost never meet, the claims of the advocates. For those of you interested in this literature, it's a kind of nitpicking type of stuff. There's a book, a recent book by myself and a couple of colleagues called Councils in Cooperation. They've got 2 chapters on it, which big tables for those of you who want no accounts of what's wrong with the literature and so on. That's a detailed the most detailed available summary. There is new work which now is shedding more light. This basically stems back to a fellow called Reese Andrews. He works at the Cardiff University, the business school, and he is surely one of the best empirical scholars in modern applied public administration. He's a kind of a genius. I might add he's one of the best beer drinkers I've ever seen. It's quite something. He and another guy called George Boyne at the business school in Cardiff, they developed a new technique for looking at the question of amalgamation. In the UK, they hadn't then, they still haven't had amalgamation, forced amalgamation. What they did have at that point, though, was some councils in England volunteered to amalgamate. Andrews had excellent data, beautiful so-called panel data, that's not cross-section for 1 year, across several years. And he thought, let's look at those councils that were amalgamating, hadn't even amalgamated yet, amalgamating councils, compare them with statistically similar non-merged councils that just carried on. And he asked the question, are there any differences? And he was surprised at the significant differences that emerged. Massive dislocation and so on. This was evident in cost structures. This is not asking people questions, this is not questionnaire surveys, this is looking at annual account statements, annual reports and so on. In Australia we haven't had this. I had discussions with Reese about this, and this really struck me as a massive breakthrough. It's one of those things, the minute you see it, you think, geez, what a good idea, I should have thought of that about 15 years ago. He's just a fellow that does think of things. We thought this is brilliant. We applied this to New South Wales local government. A colleague of mine, Mike Court, painstakingly constructed a data set from I think 7 years. This is panel data. It takes ages. It's a 5-month job. More or less killed Mike, but the poor fellow got it right. We then had this beautiful data set. We took Reese's his method, we applied it exactly the same, used the same rationale, and we found no relationship between council size and council cost. Some small councils were in fact efficient in terms of costs, some large ones inefficient. No systematic statistical difference. That's the first time a study like that has been done in Australian local government. We all owe Mike Court a big vote of thanks. It takes a sort of a degree of single-mindedness not many people I haven't got anyway. That was published, it was peer-reviewed, it's published in a journal called Administration and Society. For those of you in the university, nowadays the mad methodology of contemporary Australian universities, that's a so-called A-star journal. That's the gold standard. Actually the refereeing wasn't even a good of anything. What inference can we draw from that from a policy point of view? Well, the 2004 New South Wales forced amalgamation process didn't work. It didn't work because there's no difference between those councils that got forcibly amalgamated and other councils. No systematic statistical difference. We've taken Reese's approach and also applied it. We took the data, we had a bit of luck. Deloitte Access Economics, the Property Council of Tasmania hired them, paid them quite a lot of money, and they did an analysis of Tasmanian local government. We got their data. In a rare slip-up, the data was, we managed to get a hold of their data. We used Reese's technique here. We could find no relationship between council size and council costs. That thing also been through the refereeing process, peer-reviewed so-called. Those of you interested, those tragics here interested in the nitty-gritty of this, can have a look at the Australian Journal of Public Administration. It's just come out now in the March issue. I can't wait till Deloitte Access Economics finds this thing and please be a read. It's going to be an interesting talk. We're presently working on Queensland. We've done some preliminary statistical estimations. We've got nice Queensland data also now. Very nice Queensland data. We're looking at pre- and post-amalgamations in Queensland. So you take the two sets of councils there. You've got two samples. You've got amalgamated Queensland councils as one sample. You've got non-amalgamated as the other sample. And you check the rate of change of costs and the absolute level of cost of service delivery right across all the different functions. We can find no statistical difference in Queensland. No statistical difference. There's some slight thing which you'd expect because of the costs of amalgamation. That amalgamated come the disruptive effects that amalgamated councils are doing slightly worse, but it's only significant at about the 10% level. It's not high enough, you want 5%. There's some ironical outcomes in Queensland. We found that compulsory merged councils, or the process of compulsory mergers, increased the number of councils with diseconomies of scale. So if you think of council size along a horizontal axis, as councils get bigger, costs fall. Economies of scale, this is a classic economic theory, you reach some minimum point, up she goes again. The average size of Queensland councils have been shifted from the increasing scale portion of the curve to the decreasing scale portion of the curve. That's an interesting result too. That's not yet finalised, and it hasn't been published or reviewed yet. We've done some modelling on Perth because of all the excitement there with the Robson report. We've done a similar, taken Reese's technique, applied it there, and we can find no scale economies, cost savings, or any other pecuniary gains. This, of course, is proposed. This isn't ex post. It would be better if it is ex post, but tough on those councils that are guinea pigs in an experiment. If you think of specific functions, 2 of the 10 main functions we found had significant scale economies. I can't now recall offhand. I think one of them was really strange. It was parks and gardening, which I think there's an anomaly there because I wouldn't intuitively think so. We've done some preliminary work. We're busy now on the Sydney merger proposals that my colleague Graham is going to talk about in a moment. We can find no evidence at all for scale economies in Sydney. That's a significant point because if you're making claims to amalgamate Sydney councils, there are no scale economies, but there's significant costs attached to the process of amalgamation that you're looking for pecuniary disadvantage quite quickly. What can we say then? In summary, there's very limited empirical evidence in support of a claim that council size is negatively related to council expenditure. We find that there is no basic statistical relationship. We've now looked at, we haven't finalised it, basically 4 states. We hope by the time we're finished with this exercise, we'll have gone right across. In all the territories difficult because there's not enough observations. And then we want to have a look at New Zealand as well. But the data in New Zealand is not that good. Anyway, we hope to eventually have a look at all jurisdictions. The conclusion, this last dot point here, my colleague Mike Court forced me to add this. I don't really 100% agree, but since Mike's done it so much, is that he said you must tell them that total expenditure is the most important category to consider as it measures how much ratepayers must pay for all of their services. He's right in the sense that you're aggregating, you can find scale economies in one function or another, but I mean what basically matters is the average cost, total average cost, because that's the cost of the ratepayer faces. And that's the cost you guys have to defend against your constituents when they hear about cost increases. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that there's a chance for some questions.
So questions? Brian Bell from Local City Council in New South Wales, Professor Dollery. Thank you for your scholarly presentation. Around local government in Australia, you are at the top of the trees in terms of what you do. For those that have been observing the sort of stuff that you do, it's time that this stuff got out and was understood by the general local government people in Australia. we value, thinking local government values your work in terms of the evidence-based data analysis. So thank you for that. But I do have a question. Can you talk to us if there's a statistical relationship between the New South Wales State Government Treasury Corp financial sustainability indicators and the population size of local councils in Sydney? I think that's critical.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for those kind words. When he says something like that, I'm getting worried now. What does he want? He wants me to shout him dinner or something. Thank you very much. It's very gracious of you. It's an interesting question. Just for those of you who New South Wales is, local government's heavily focused on the independent panel and its deliberations presently. As part of that process, the New South Wales Treasury checked out, looked at local government, assessed financial sustainability in local government. They used this in accounting so-called ratio approach. They took different ratios and compared 4 different councils and compared them to benchmarks. Benchmarks was usually a range, for example, debt coverage ratios, things like that. They had a look at those things. They didn't make any, all they said was actually that financial sustainability was declining in New South Wales local government. We knew that already from the Allen report. Many of you would have read that report in 2006, a really excellent effort by Percy Allen, fine scholar, apart from his many other things. We knew that already, that financial sustainability isn't good in New South Wales, not getting better. We know some of the reasons for it, one of which is rate picking, of course, and others. But no one, as yet, no one's looked in detail, asked the question, so is there any relationship between the Treasury, which sets out these financial sustainability ratios, and sets out a whole lot of ratios for each council? If we take those ratios and regress them, run a statistical, see if there's any statistical relationship between, say, councils that are classified by the New South Wales Treasury as poor performing in financial sustainability ratio terms. I think they've got categories: poor, moderate, something. There's three or four categories. I can't now remember. They don't offer a justification for why they have that number. But if one asks the empirical question, is there a relationship between how a given council gets classified and the size of that council as measured in population terms? There should be, shouldn't there? That's the implicit, would be a claim you'd make if you were you'd say, right, let's amalgamate New South Wales local council. Someone would say, why is that? I'd say, because look at it, the financial sustainability is not good. But a checkmate rebuttal of that point is to come along and say, but there's no relationship between council size and how the classification of councils according to their financial sustainability. That's an empirical question. We've looked at that question. We're still looking at it. We can find, I'm pleased to tell those councils affected, we can find no relationship at all between size and the classification of sustainability. That is a very interesting finding, and those of you who read the press in New South Wales, you'll be hearing a lot more about that in days to come.
Thank you. Patrick from Wellington. The presentation talked a lot about total cost of council being a great measure and that there were no economies achieved. I'm just wondering if the studies looked at all into whether councils were delivering more services, for example, fixing roads faster, more capital works, achieving economies through that way. And also I'm wondering if it looked into the changes in governance and any efficiencies or changes that were achieved that way.
No, we just looked at costs in our study. That, of course, would be a next step. That's difficult to do, right? And really expensive to do those kind of studies, because you have to contact each council and find out. You can't just get it off the annual statement. It's difficult. That would be a nice question, but no, we just looked at raw costs. To some extent, you can defend it. Reese defends that kind of thing, Reese Andrews, because raw cost data anyway captures all these thousands of other influences. some of which are idiosyncratic. Some particular council had bad rainfall or no rainfall, or things happened that pushed up or either increased or decreased the cost of providing services. But the total cost figure kind of aggregates that. A bit like in medicine, the doctor takes your temperature and it kind of gives him an overall feel. You've got an inflamed elbow or something, up goes your temperature, or you've got a sore throat. It's a kind of an index, comparative index.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. Robin Knox from City of Darwin. In relation to the Northern Territory, when they talked of amalgamation, the communities were terrified of it coming in. It did come in, and the communities voted the NT government out of office as a result. But the main reasons that put forward was seemed to be to stop the corruption, which, in small places, people moved on and there was barely was it probably may not have been recorded, or there were very few convictions. And the second reason was that the communities would be able to apply for a lot of grants, and federal government grants that apparently they weren't either eligible or able to get. Have you got any comment on that, please?
Thank you. That's interesting points you make. Not a lot. I'm going to go up there. There's a fellow there, you probably know him, Nigel Graves. He's a Central Land Council guy. He's a wealth of information on that kind of thing. I'm going up to hold talks. Nigel, by the way, has just got a PhD in local government. So we're long-standing chums now. But I'm going to go up there and he's going to advise me on that type of thing. But we haven't done any assessment of the Northern Territory before that yet. But thanks for that.
Andrew Kieran, Councillor of South East Shire Council. I'll own up to being a strong advocate of regional collaboration. Is it correct, and I've seen some of your earlier writings, that there is compelling empirical evidence that shared services approach, when done properly, is far more effective in terms of reducing the overall cost structure for council services and for councils?
Thanks. Yeah, that's an interest. The alternative in terms of cost lowering and regional integration to a forced amalgamation is, of course, shared services, joint service. But there's lots of, as you know, lots of different variations. You qualified what you were saying with the caveat, if done properly,
yes. And
that's a really important thing. We all know there's right across Australia, there are all kinds of shared service outfits, ROCs. Some of them have an annual dinner, and that's about it. Others are extremely successful in providing joint services, so it's a real patchwork. I've got theories on how one can improve the capacity of these things, but you're quite correct. A big reason for that is, in economics we call it selection bias. So councils deliver lots of services. Some of them, of course, have got big scaling, for instance, big economies of scale or economies of scope. The kind of arrangements you're talking about, sensibly applied, says, all right, say for example, service X or function X has got big scale economies, let's do that jointly. Of course it's going to be more efficient than doing it severally, because you're reaping these scale economies. It's kind of common sense. Our council's doing all of these things, some with no scale economies, some with scale economies, some with diseconomies. It's a confluence of lots of different things. The secret is to pick which functions are done, and then one of the other things is that, I think, in my own research is anyways, the checkmate element that seems to be around, where you have 10 councils saying, one gets disaffected, they say, if you go ahead and do that, we're going to pick our marbles up and go home. And that terrifies everybody else into doing nothing. That's, in my experience, quite a problem. There are ways around that, so-called binding alliances and so on. There's an excellent idea Brian Bell's got, perhaps Brian would care to comment on it at some point. He's got a suggestion for a council of mayors, a legislative framework, so your mayors in a regional setting have a meeting, they say, right, let's do this jointly, and then they all sign off on a document. That's a legally binding document. There's no more 6 months later, cold feet, okay, we're walking out of it.
The last two questions, Ron.
Yeah, Brian, Craig Richardson from Wagga. I was just interested in your views on whether amalgamations have contributed to building strategic capacity amongst councils.
That is an interesting point. Strategic capacity, of course, is non-measurable. It's largely in the eye of the beholder. I think that there are cases, yes, where amalgamation has built strategic capacity. The problem is the cost at which it comes. The social cost, all the stuff that gentleman yesterday spoke about. For small communities, it's devastating. Wagga's is a big place, but if you got combined with little places around there, like around Tamworth, for example, in the 204 New South Wales amalgamation, all those little places there, they're all devastated. Half of them are closing down, they're ghost towns now. You took the major employer out of town, there's no representation, you've got a small population next to a big place, you get one vote if you're lucky amongst 10, no one listens to the guy, he gets frustrated, he gives up after a while. The costs are, I agree, you do sometimes, of course, yeah, the costs are high. I think, if I might just sum up, everybody knows in a university, in a council, in a business firm, leadership's critical. If you have good leaders, that is professional managers, good counsel, but highly functional elected leaders, you're going to have reasonable outcomes. If you have bad leaders, you've got a big council, a small one, that's the key thing. People always make a difference. It's common sense. I mean, you look around, you look at functional families, dysfunctional families, you find the same thing. People are the key ingredient in making things happen or not happen, or happen well. So you can't get away from it. You can't pretend structure somehow can remove the human element. You just can't get away from the need for excellent managers and excellent elected representatives.
Brian, last question.
Thank you. Rick Hart from Warringah Council in New South Wales, along with our hills, the other end of the table, somewhere there, who are one of the strongest, of course, in New South Wales. So hopefully it's with some qualification about speaking. But I myself went across with a couple of other staff to Auckland, had spent time talking to Auckland City, the New Auckland City Council, both the deputy mayor, I spoke with my mayor at the political level, and we spoke with advisors who were ex-CEOs of the previous councils that were there, and also with staff. The interesting facts that come out of that were, the first one is that in setting it up, the New Zealand government said that they would front with the costs up front of the Auckland Transition Unit, which was the unit that took the merger and put it forward into the entity, and that those costs totalled up at the end of the day of something like $92 million. We were informed by the both officers and political side that that debt was repaid within 2 years. So I think there is some evidence of savings. The second thing is those people who were dead against it, which included the political people up front and staff and people who didn't eventually get jobs, do grudgingly admit at the end of the day, that's what they told us, is that they thought it was the best thing for Auckland to actually have a super city to get it in. They have achieved one unitary plan, which was the impossibility they couldn't achieve beforehand as joint councils, as a seven councils originally. So they have achieved that in that time frame. So, and then Wellington City, which was made up of something like 9 councils, the Greater Wellington area, you now have the prospect of 3 councils coming out of that entirely voluntarily because of the need to have a stronger voice with the national government. The driver is that. So things are happening. So I guess my question to you is, and partially you made a comment on it, is if amalgamations aren't the answer, given the status of local government throughout Australia, what is the answer? Second thing, question is, if all things are equal, i.e. leadership, good everything else, all things equal, does big have a better chance of survival in today's age and a better chance of negotiating with the higher tiers of government than small?
If we think, which I take it you're talking from a metropolitan-only angle, in Auckland, the Greater Auckland Council now is, of course, the metropolitan area of Auckland. I was there prior to the main instigating factor for Auckland, by the way, for amalgamation. If you blow away all the bubbles and froth about it and the Kiwi hubris, was the impending World Cup that was coming along. They felt they had to do something about that. You'd have a big highway. It's no longer the case there, but it was just prior to the World Cup. Many of you would experience. You drive along a highway and there's a set of traffic lights in the middle of it. so some little off-road people can come on the thing. It wasn't, they didn't have a proper freeway set up and all that. And they knew they had to do something about the impending traffic jams and parking problems for the World Cup, and they did it. And because of the zest for rugby there, the public went along. If we take the analogy of Auckland and apply it to Australia, and one thinks that Auckland was a good idea, then you must realise what you're calling for. You're calling for one local government in Melbourne, one local government in Sydney, and one in Perth. Those of you who think that's a good idea, go, and many of you do, go and have a look at Brisbane. Ask yourself questions. What is the cost structure of the Brisbane Council? How does that compare with other large, it is the largest council in Australia. How does it compare for all the metropolitan planning that's been going on in the Greater Brisbane region? Let's see its effect on traffic flows there, for example. Compare it to Melbourne here, where we've got several different councils. And I think the answer is fairly obvious. The world is full of big cities, really big places like London, like Los Angeles, like New York. They don't have one big council there. Is anybody seriously telling me a place like London isn't a reasonably well-run place? The difficulties of planning there being compounded by all the historical elements there. You can't knock buildings down, 1,000-year buildings and so on. Of course not. You have, if you want to run effective planning and lobbying in a metropolitan context, you have a metropolitan-wide authority like the Greater London Authority, and you have simultaneously local governments. It's not a problem. If you want to do it cheaply rather than the expensive way, which the Greater London Authority is, you take Brian Bell's suggestion of a council of mayors. So you don't need a massive bureaucracy. You just have binding council decision making. Almost free, nothing is free, almost free. People don't like it, you've got directly elected mayors, they can fire the mayor. Thank you.
Can you please thank Brian Dollery?